space. And Jordan Mitchell-King is a historian of dress and textiles with a particular emphasis on making practices and embodied experiences of dress. Her dissertation looks at 18th century quilted waistcoats, examining their production, consumption, and mediation. She also makes use of experimental historical methodologies through reconstructive and embodied approaches. So now we're going to start about 25 minutes of a roundtable discussion. So firstly, I'm going to kick off with the question of how are intersecting spaces present in your research? And I'm going to ask Jordan maybe to kick that one off.
Yes, so my research into quilted waistcoats and jumps has really brought out the importance of the public and the private as these sort of potentially distinct but also blurred spaces, and the kind of dress practices that take place within and across those. And so I've really found that the private has been an important element as this kind of intimate and informal space where undressed clothing, which is kind of the category that waistcoats come into, could be worn acceptably. But then there's also this kind of ambiguity because the rules of what you could wear seem to vary across class as well. And so for non-elite women, wearing these clothes in more public spaces seems to be more of a common practice than it is for elite women. And so that whole sort of debate around public and private, which is really quite a big one in the 18th century, kind of historiography has been quite present in my research.
Fascinating, thank you. And as probably most of you can realise, we've got a specialisation over the 18th century on this panel, not necessarily planned, but here we are. I don't know, maybe Freya, you'd like to pick on that, how maybe intersecting spaces are present in your research.
Well, intersecting spaces kind of makes up the bulk of my research on my dissertation, as it's hard to look at the city and not consider how space features in it. What I'm really interested in it is looking at how these spaces are lived in and the lived experience of them and how they function. And I think a lot of the time when we think of the city as a space, we think of like a building, roads, streets, etc. Those are the aspects of design that we really think of. But as my research into the Salop stall shows, there's loads of ephemeral kind of non-official elements of design that go into making up a city, that make up our experiences of it. And it's kind of bringing the history of design into looking at that idea of space. Like, how do we navigate spaces in our daily routine? What kind of builds our maps of the city is our experiences of them.
That's fascinating. And for everyone who doesn't necessarily know, could you maybe just briefly say what saloop is?
Saloop is a hot drink that arrives in the 18th century, or 17th century, and disappears at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's primarily drunk by labouring classes as a beverage in the morning.
Wonderful, thank you. And lastly, on to Alyssa, how are intersecting spaces present in your research?
Yes, mine kind of goes with the ambiguity that Jordan was talking about, as well as the functionality that Freya was talking about. With formal dining in the British country house, you have this non-static, flexible space where the house itself is a home, it's somebody's house. But then through the 18th century, it starts becoming more informal and more entertaining. So you have sections that are kind of shifted off to be more public, whereas during the formal dinner, it is considered a little bit more of a public space, whereas you have more private spaces that only specific guests would be allowed into. But then through my research, I've been reading about how public and private, it's just so ambiguous because it goes down to function, that Irving Goffman suggested backstage versus front stage, which I think is really relevant when you're talking about the formal country house dinner, because it is a stage, and during the dinner, that is the front stage, but then there's the backstage spaces of the servants preparing that meal. And so you have that dichotomy there, which I think is really lovely with a country house.
That's a really fascinating dimension.
Just wanted to jump in on that. What
sorry.
Alyssa was saying there about kind of the backstage, front stage, and how the meanings of public and private kind of vary depending on sort of context and use. And I think it's like a really important point to be made for the 18th century and probably for other periods as well, that like definitions of public and private are quite different to what they are today. You know, the home as a concept is very much a private, although I suppose that's been eroded a bit with working from home and Zoom and everything, but the home is very much considered a private space, whereas today, whereas in the 18th century, it wasn't that same kind of line of demarcation, and it was much more about accessibility and who was or wasn't allowed into that space that defined it as private, rather than it being sort of home and not home.
Well, yeah, that's a really good good place actually to move on to our next question about thinking about who's allowed into which space and why, which is what relationship does class have in the intersecting spaces that you research? I know some of you have mentioned this already, and maybe are there any other dimensions that this analysis can help you reveal?
Yeah, so going off of the front stage, backstage, I got really interested in looking at the footmen particularly because they are present in that front stage space, but they're part of the labor creating the scene, the stage, the performance. And I got really interested in livery actually. And so how their physical bodies they're embodying the commoditization that reflects the porcelain on the table, and how their visual and aesthetic bodies in combination with their labor are helping to create this. And the fact that the elites, people participating in this dinner, are actually very vocal about the footmen and their role, and how they kind of prefer the dessert when they're gone, or that Horace Walpole was in France and they were talking about religion at the dinner table, and he was like, we would never do that with our servants present. And that just kind of really made me start wanting to look into that aspect of, but what are the servants' roles beyond just serving the table?
Fascinating. I don't know if Jordan, you want to pick up on that too.
Yeah, I've already sort of mentioned a bit that class really is sort of popped up as a really important sort of dimension in my research that I hadn't necessarily anticipated in the same way that I had been thinking about public and private spaces when I went into it, because very much in sort of visual record in particular, elite women just aren't shown wearing these garments, quilted waistcoats and jumps, but also undress more generally in paintings, in sort of prints and graphic literature and all that kind of stuff. Whereas working women definitely are, but the interpretation of that is really is itself quite ambiguous. So there's sources which suggest that it's a perfectly respectable thing to wear out in public as a non-elite or working woman. But then there's these other sources, mostly coming from male perspectives, who are really like upset or angry or whatever it is about women wearing these clothes. And they also have these kind of associations of sexuality, of just sort of a general kind of griminess and unkemptness. And it really ties into all these moral discourses at the time around kind of female honor and sort of propriety in particular. And that's much more of a burdensome thing, I think, for working class women in this period. So although elite women obviously are still subject to these kind of sexual and moral ideologies, it's a bit easier for them to kind of get around them and navigate them. And they also just really don't wear those clothes in public at all, which I'm sure is for that reason, but it sort of means they aren't treading that same line that it seems that working class women have to tread a bit more.
Really interesting to hear about that kind of intersection as well, that intersectionality between class and gender in your research. Thank you. And maybe Freya as well, if you can talk a little bit about how class and intersecting spaces, what relationship they have in your research.
Like I kind of hinted to it earlier when I was describing the Salop stall. Class is a really big part of what I was researching, because these stalls are overwhelmingly patronized by market gardeners, carters, basically all the people who are working in London and getting things moving. And that's the defining factor. When they're written about by other sources, it is always a presence in kind of like, it's associated with being lower class. And this was one of the things I found really interesting, because when I first started studying Salop, it was very much an upper class or kind of drink consumed like chocolate, but somewhere along the way, because it seems to be consumed in these spaces, it gets an association, and that changes the drink itself because it's consumed in these spaces, that it becomes associated with the lower classes. And one of the other reasons that I went into this was, again, it was tied to class, in that overwhelmingly when we're discussing consumption of hot beverages in the 18th century, there are very fixed ideas people have, or there are loads of ideas that really kind of jump to people, which is like the coffee house, elite dining spaces, which are fantastic and I do love them. But there is often this association with the middling and the elite, that it's the kind of tea table all the ladies sit around when they're having their hot tea and gossiping. And I wanted to unpick that further to see if there were like, well, what are these spaces on the street? Because surely they're not being patronized by the middling, but if that is a hot beverage being that is new, what can that add to this wider discussion and add to the spectrum of goods?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight. And we're going to move on to maybe a little slightly more tricky question. And maybe Freya, you can start us off actually again with this one. So the question is, are there challenges of working on intersecting spaces as a design historian, maybe especially for all of you as a design historian of the 18th century? You know, have you found any particular challenges in that?
I think one that I can talk to, which probably everyone on this panel can relate to, is that it's a matter of surviving materials. Very little of what I research survives. So like the key material components, sorry, word blindness, components don't survive the same way that you do of their kind of higher value versions. And as these stalls were kind of ephemeral spaces, they don't have a brick and mortar building. They're only made from their designed components. That means the spaces I research don't exist, which creates its own kind of unique challenges. And it's really having to be broad in which materials you use and be kind of trying to tease the most out of the widest variety of sources. So it's using that kind of writing about the middle that you get in the period by the middle classes of the kind of laboring poor, but pulling in satirical prints, pulling in court cases, trying to weave this idea of the space through many, many different sources.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that's something that both Jordan and Lisa recognise too. Maybe Georgie could pick that up as well, about the challenges that you faced in your research.
Yeah, no, I mean, what Freya's saying about, kind of pulling from lots of different sources, quite varied sources, and having to kind of weave a picture together on that. I mean, I'm fortunate in that there are material remains of what I study. There's quite a few, and kind of managed to like track those down over the course of my research, which was really useful. In terms of, I think there's been two kind of big challenges, and one that maybe speaks more to what Freya was talking about, which is that not just about things not surviving, but things not being recorded in the first place.
Exactly.
Again, especially as it pertains to class and gender as well. So a big issue for me in looking at both the production and the consumption of these garments is I can find stuff about what elite women were doing, because although they don't do it that often, they do occasionally reference these items. You know, I'm going to send you a pair of jumps or whatever it is. But for other women, even if they might have been literate, they weren't writing that down, they weren't setting it down, and other people weren't coming to them and asking them to talk about it and then writing it down for them. And so you really miss that perspective. And all the perspectives I have on non-elite women wearing these garments are, as I've already mentioned, coming from male sources, usually quite wealthy male sources. And so there's this really specific view that they have on these clothes. And the tone difference in how the women talking about it within their own circles and the men talking about it when describing other people is huge. So amongst these networks of women, it's often quite a nurturing kind of tone. It's about health and concern for each other's well-being and all these kinds of things. And then when it's outsiders, normally male outsiders, talking about other women, it's so much more aggressive and kind of condemnatory. And so being able to find ways around that has been a big challenge, and that's kind of where I've brought in things like reconstruction and wearing as a way of trying to access these kind of knowledge systems and processes that don't get put down in the record in the first place.
Maybe actually before we move on to Alyssa and some challenges she's faced in her research, could you quickly talk to us a little bit maybe about how you go about reconstruction, because not everyone might have heard of that as a historical methodology.
Yeah, so I first sort of decided to do it as a way of looking at the production of clothing, because again, it's mostly seamstresses, it's females, fairly poorly paid, fairly lowly valued by kind of histories of kind of trades, and the garment trades tend to focus more on tailors, which is the kind of male side of the garment trade. And so for me, it was about using the material remains of the surviving garments as a way of then recreating that process of making a quilted waistcoat was what I made. And from that, trying to draw out conclusions that you don't get in the written record. So it ended up being a lot about the time it took and trying to figure out, okay, I'm obviously not as experienced as an 18th century seamstress, but if I think about how my time sped up as I got more experience, and then if I kind of try and account for someone who would be more experienced, how long was it taking them to make these garments? And then what does that equate to in terms of money per kind of hour and labor? And unsurprisingly, it's pretty low, as it is in the time period generally acknowledged to be. And also kind of the material, like the kind of lived experience of making, and like little tiny details, like figuring out how they got better grip on the needle when they were pulling it out during the quilting process. And it's like a tiny little thing, and it's not gonna change the course of how we understand 18th century history, but it's a little detail that kind of adds to like the richness and the thickness of these lives that are really just not that well represented or recorded historically.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think we're definitely going to be coming back onto methodology, so we'll probably touch on that again, but thanks for that, Jordan. And I'd over to you, Alyssa, maybe on the challenges that you found working on your kind of intersecting spaces.
Yeah, I use a lot of interdisciplinary resources because my background is in art history, so I do like to bring that in a little bit. But I've been very lucky with this. For letters and diaries, I found a lot of literary figures, both men and women, that are writing about dining. For me, one of the bigger challenges is that I'm a ceramics historian, and I couldn't hold the ceramics. So like I recently kind of, after the Great Pottery Throwdown, I've been learning a little bit more about the making, which I am signing up for pottery classes for my birthday to do a little bit more of the haptic as well. But the slip casting of the trompe l'oeil that I study is going to be a lot lighter than a press molded ceramic, and not being able to feel that difference or feel like the texture that's put into the trompe l'oeil porcelain has been really sad, and I'm hoping to get back into it. I've definitely got further research I'm planning, but then also not being able to go into the country houses while I was in England, which now I'm back in Texas, so I have to wait until I can travel is okay to go back. I did try to get into a couple, but I couldn't get into the archives and work with things that were had not been touched before and find new things. So that was a little bit frustrating, but I was lucky to be able to find enough sources. I would say the second challenge that I faced was actually having the confidence to challenge some of the assumptions that have already been made about these spaces. Like it seems like something that's been a lot's been done on, but in reality it hasn't. But there are like these overarching, like gender has been a really big one that I've kind of had to fight and like really fight with myself to figure out how to discuss it. But a lot of people, because of tea, are saying, well, the dining room is masculine and tea and this waiting room is feminine. But it's like, what about during the formal dinner when you have both genders? Can you call that a gendered space? So I've been really challenging myself to push past that and say, you know what, we don't have to call this a gendered space because it is a political space, it's a social space, and it's a formal space, whereas the rest of the house would be more informal. And that, just being able to say, no, I'm challenging this, has been a big struggle that I've overcome, and I'm really happy about that. But I still want to touch that porcelain.
I think we're all happy you've overcome it. It's been a fascinating journey to watch. And kind of building on that, I mean, again, everybody sort of mentioned this already, but maybe just having a kind of more focused answer on this. How do you build your methodology when you're kind of trying to navigate these these kind of intersecting spaces in your work, and I know Jordan's mentioned maybe kind of reconstruction, but yeah, is there a tip or a trick that you found really helped? I don't know, maybe Freya, you'd like to start off?
One way I found really useful to this kind of builds off Alyssa's point of handling the object, but was trying to think of histories of sense, and the kind of bring in that element of how would what did each individual factors of these stalls do to create a space, and how sense plays into that, because there's all the things such as the heat from these stalls, the light, all stuff that can help you start to get an understanding of what these spaces would have been like to use and why they do what they do. Sorry, I've just got word blindness.
No, that's fine. No, I think senses and sort of sensorial experiences are a really great window into especially some really complex eras in the past.
Yeah. Also, I tried, like Jordan, to do some recreations, because obviously I've centered this around this drink that you can't just pick up in the Tesco anymore. And trying to do certain things like that and recreate it as best as I could. I wasn't able to get it fully there, but like, again, that plays into the idea of sense of like, well, what is it these people are consuming at the end of the day? And what is this process they're going through?
Absolutely. I know that we probably all enjoyed watching your Instagram trying to recreate Salute during lockdown. I don't know, maybe Alyssa, if you want to take on this idea about methodology and explaining how you went about it.
Yeah, and I mean, other than just working interdisciplinary and then being able to hold the objects, one thing that would be really interesting, which I think I would have to have some significant help with, would be doing the recreations of some of these recipes with the material. Like if you could, in an ideal world, host a full 18th century formal dinner with costume, candlelight, porcelain, and then have some ridiculous recipes on the table. They're with trompe-l'oeil porcelain and tricking your guests. You also get that with these recipes. I was in a lecture and she was talking about how they wanted to make this dish that looked like a watermelon, and it was like meat combination on the inside for the red, and then like spinach wrapped around it on the outside for the green, which is ridiculous. But it would like, to be able to do that and recreate that and see it and smell it and taste it would be very, I mean, like I said, I'm not necessarily skilled enough, but I do know some people who are, so I might have to think about getting in touch with them to work on something like that and improving the experience in my understanding of the experience.
Yeah, and I think that like kind of haptic thing, which you've both been talking about, and I mean, Alyssa, you're like doing this like amazing recreation of a 18th century formal dinner. Yes, please. But I think like there was a project, I think I was listening to Amanda Vickery talk about recently, which she did a while ago, on recreating a Regency ball with the same sort of thing of like everything, of the clothes and the dances and the candles and the music and everything, and talking about how the sensorial kind of overload of that was just like a whole new thing that hadn't necessarily been anticipated. And I think that's a really exciting, that kind of opening up what we think of as historical methodology and appropriate kind of academic methodologies is a really exciting thing that's sort of taken hold kind of fairly recently, and creates this whole other kind of haptic, sensorial, kind of embodied experience and version of the past. And that's obviously not to say that you can perfectly recreate the past, and it's obviously a different thing if you're doing it as a academic researcher versus say as a reason for public engagement, and say in a museum or a living history site or something like that. But I think kind of developing methodologies around that and finding ways of integrating that with sort of more traditional academic methodologies is it's something I'm really interested in, obviously, because I've already spoken about it, but something that's really valuable to expanding our boundaries of how we think about the past, and then it's not just this kind of dry, faded thing that you see on paper, vivid and alive.
This entire conversation actually reminded me of one of the methodologies I'd really wanted to do, which again, it touches on that experience, which is site visits. And it's the challenge of doing a site visit. So all these places are in the city. So in theory, I could go and use the street potentially as an object to explore. How does that street function? Where will people be? Like, how do things flow through it? And it's that, but in there's always the challenge, because like with many different objects, and you'd have this with, as you know, with your country houses. I know one of our tutors calls it the lasagna effect, but it's the layering of history. So it's like, in theory, I can go to that site and use it as a source, but how do you separate it from everything in that present moment and engage with that? And that's something I really want to try to do further, but because of lockdown this year, I haven't had the chance to engage as much with as I'd like to.
Of course, and actually I think that's a really good point to ask our next question, which is, what have you learned through your research on intersecting spaces, and how are you going to maybe apply this to future research, maybe as a design historian or future work even beyond academia? I don't know who would want to start that one off. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer, or Alyssa maybe? Yeah, go for it.
With that one. When I started this dissertation, this is something I said in my viva, I thought it was going to be an ending, and that you do the paper, you submit it, next step. So now I realize it's actually just a beginning, and it's a beginning for work I wanted to do. And I was fighting moving back to America quite a bit, but now that I'm here, I've decided to accept that and then really run with it. So now I'm taking my research and focusing what I've learned from 18th century British country houses and applying it to 18th century, which they just call historic houses in colonial America, and looking now at how did the British identity of social ritual and British porcelain, British ceramics, how did Americans that were still kind of balancing that British identity, American identity, did they use that to hold on to that identity, or did they reject that identity and reject the rituals that came with it? And that's something I've got a couple of things I'm working on to start that, but I just want to keep going. Like, I love dining and I love ceramics, which is what I've really learned from my dissertation. I'm coming out of this just as much passionate, and I was afraid I would come out of it and like, I never want to look at this again. But I just want to kind of keep taking this and turn it globally even after this. You know, what all does this affect, and how can we use one starting point to look at other things in different ways?
Yeah, and I think
so inspirational. Thank you, Alyssa. No, go for it.
That really speaks to kind of the nature of doing any kind of research, which is that you think you found an answer to something and it just starts like 1,000 more questions, which is the wonderful thing about it. I mean, for me, it's definitely about just extending what I've already done on quilted waistcoats into undress as this whole category, and the kind of broader intersections with space, but also with time. And there's been a little bit of written about this already, of kind of the idea of time as this way of dividing up the day, and in the 18th century, these kind of concerns about people using their time in the wrong way, because it means they're not kind of being productive citizens, whatever that means for them, depending on their class and gender. But yeah, I think what Alyssa was saying about how these avenues of, you start with one little bit of like design history, and it just keeps expanding out, I think I mean, it's true for all history, but I think with design history, the sort of interdisciplinary nature of it really lends it towards that kind of ever expanding relevance to, you know, whatever. And that can be outwards in kind of themes or geography, but also kind of forwards and backwards in time as well. Because a while ago, I was trying to explain my research to someone, I can't remember who it was, and they were kind of sort of just like, oh, it's basically just like 18th century loungewear, right? And I was just like, yeah, it actually is. And it's obviously, it's not a perfect simile, but it works quite well. And it's sort of been that being pointed out to me has then sort of made me reevaluate how those trends of clothing and informal clothing intersect with gender and class today still very much. And, you know, who is wearing kind of loungewear at the house only or outside of the house, and then obviously the kind of the breakdown of some of those boundaries in the last year, with the sort of Zoom headshot and that being it. You know, you can wear whatever else you want without anyone even knowing. So yeah, that's quite a rambling answer. I'm not even sure it's an answer to the question, but
no, thank you for sharing that. And lastly, Freya, how are you going to apply what you've learned in the future?
well, I kind of touched this on. There's still work I'd like to do regarding site work. Mine is also kind of similar to Jordan's. It's the idea of time. Time was a factor that just kept seeming to come through in my research on these spaces, and how the daily patterns of the city shift, and how the same space was like one space, but depending on the time of day, you'd get very different audiences, and also some of the questions of night. The salop stalls were predominantly open during the morning, but also at night, and it raises the question of how these streets, which are viewed in the day, how they're viewed at night, how time can change how people interact with spaces. And it's only in the very beginning stages, hence why I'm slightly vague about this, but there's something there to be unpicked about how do you kind of view these many audiences for one space.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I think that's brought us to a really good ending actually of our kind of organic roundtable discussion. I thought I'd just maybe end on some words that I picked out that I think were quite relevant to everybody's research with intersecting spaces. And those are perspective, senses, performance, intersectionality, confidence, moral discourses, ephemeral, identity, ritual, ambiguity, audiences, functionality, and lived experiences. I hope that's a good word summary.
That's a great word summary.
That's great. A little poem there to end. And we've got some really fantastic questions from our audience. So I'm just going to jump right into those. So firstly, Lisa asks, were women allowed to work in the 18th century?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know who wants to take that.
Yeah. One of the major people who are working on salop stalls and are women, who often, one of the reasons they're working on these stalls are because they can be fitted around other kind of tasks they have during the day. So you may have like to spend the majority of the day looking after the house for the husband or something, but salop stalls are something that you can slot in around all the other aspects of your life, it seems to be. So you do get women working, and you do get women visiting these stalls as well, but it is laboring women. So what perhaps Jordan or Alyssa can talk to other.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big subjects of my research is female seamstresses, because they were the main people making these clothes, and these were being made as part of the kind of the garment production industry, not as kind of home domestic production. So they're really not quantifiable really, because they just weren't in the historical records, and where they might appear, they're probably appearing as sort of the wife of so-and-so, or just under their husband's names. But they were put like thousands of them, just seamstresses working in London, because there was a huge amount of work to be doing. So yeah, women absolutely were working. And like I mentioned, these garments being seen on public were largely on the bodies of working women. And it's possible that these sorts of forms of undress and informal clothing were more well suited if you were doing sort of slightly more laborious work, because they do allow for a bit more movement. I mean, I kind of kick back against the idea that it's like really comfortable compared to the really horribly uncomfortable formal clothing, but they probably do allow a bit more kind of give if you're doing like hard labor.
Yeah, thanks to the 1777 servant tax, amongst other things, the domestic servants became increasingly more female in the 18th century. I mean, you still would have male footmen, and there would still be at the divide, but the kitchen staff would be predominantly female working. And then sometimes if you had a lot of money, you could hire in a French male chef would be the ideal. But then at the end, you would get someone who could make a good meal. And if that kind of rolled out, but you did have a lot of working women in the domestic sphere at home. Now, not all of the elite women were working, or they would be doing things that they would consider work, but wouldn't be necessarily getting paid for as like intellectuals and collectors. So there's those kind of, how do we define work as well?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those answers, guys. We've got our next great question from Akshita, and that is, as we talk about the nuances and presence of class in the intersection of spaces, how relevant is it during the pandemic? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one first.
Collecting my thoughts for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think oh, go ahead, Freya.
Sorry, I think you can definitely see class and others intersecting with spaces, because if you're thinking about who are working in spaces where they're perhaps not locked down and most at risk during the pandemic, and that you can kind of see who are we allowing to like be, sorry, I have aphasia, so I get word blindness. There is the intersect of class about, so if we were looking at the street and like things about what is permissible, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have, getting word blind.
I think I get your
Maybe
point
Jordan
as
take
well.
it.
Like, the jobs that have been allowed to work from home generally are, you know, the middle class jobs, you know, the office jobs, whereas people who are just sort of working in shops or doing all sorts of other kind of more manual work are still going to work. And obviously that's important because people need to be earning money, but how we kind of support or don't support the people who have jobs in certain spaces has, I think, been quite a worrying kind of thing that's come out in the pandemic. But also I was thinking actually about how sort of the digital space and kind of the Zoom space of the discussions people have been having around obviously who has access to the technology anyway that allows you to log into Zoom, but also who has the home space to, you know, have a separate office space, or at least just hive off an area of their home that can be their office space, and who doesn't, and the kind of obligations that have been put on some people to always have their cameras on when they're in Zoom meetings, especially I think in like classes for both school children and university students. That's not something that's practical for everyone, and that may not be for classrooms, but it also often can be, because it might be that you've got your space, you know, you haven't got the space to have like a nice little background. So it definitely has been continuing to have highly relevant importance in the kind of intersection of spaces, definitely.
I think you see it a lot right now globally with heritage sites and arts and culture, that it's affecting front of house staff, back of house staff. You're getting everybody, which is ultimately affecting all classes that we're working within the heritage sites, and just seeing those jobs being, you know, cut permanently. It's been a really big effect, and that's happening everywhere. And of course, as an early career researcher, it's you know, hard coming back into that and deciding how to navigate this new world where arts and heritage are just slipping just a little bit more.
Absolutely. Well, to move on actually from that, and to move back into the streets of the 18th century city, Sophie asked, and it might be more relevant to your work, Freya, actually, have you found evidence of chat or conversation taking place as people came to the stalls to buy drinks, and were people attending those regularly?
Yes, I have. So you have stall holders who will discuss because one of my sources I use a lot is court cases, and there are stall holders who will discuss, I do know that person who did what you're accusing of them was that person, because I see them every day. I'm well acquainted with that person. He comes every morning. So you do get the sense that this is a routine people have. They're not just kind of random. They're like your daily cup of coffee is the kind of thing that seem to keep coming. It's, again, not perfect analogy, but the daily morning routines people have. And we do also get evidence of people socializing at them, and that they are a social space. So there are two main times when people drink Salute. It is either morning as a breakfast drink, which is what it predominantly is drunk as, but it is also occasionally found at nighttime when it is drunk as a hangover cure. So it's like getting the kebab after the night in the lash. You get people coming around, drinking their Salute, occasionally starting fights, occasionally picking men up to rob them, but that these are a social space. And to return to history of design, because this is a history of design symposium, a lot of that we can see affected by the kind of material culture. So there's an urn which kind of produces heat, which makes people gather. Because if you think of these people, like, people didn't have access to heat all the time. So that brings us back to the sensory. They don't have access to heat. So if you're there kind of going out on your way to work and you have this space, which it's warm, you have something to drink, that's going to invite people in, that's going to make people socialize or predisposed to. So yes, they are social spaces, which is one of the reasons I wanted to unpick them and have it that the history of consumption and socialization around these hot drinks is not solely the preserve of the elite and the middling.
Fascinating, thank you. And we've got another actually specific question to panelists, and this one's for Jordan. And Fiona asks, do you think elite women wanted to wear jumps more regularly but couldn't because they were vocally and poorly judged too much by their peers or influential men?
I mean, it's possible. I think I've kind of been trying to think this out the last few days about how we kind of think about, because like I've said, these garments are often kind of framed by people today as like more comfortable. So why were they not all just wearing them, you know? And sort of setting aside the fact that, you know, kind of physical ideas of comfort are, I think, quite a historically situated thing and they aren't continuous. Our idea of kind of having something that's really accommodating isn't necessarily true for everyone at all time periods, but there's also this kind of dimension of mental comfort, and obviously that ties into kind of ideologies and discourses around, you know, what you ought to be wearing and what's proper and respectable and neat and tidy, but you know, it's not just about oh, I want to feel kind of loose and comfortable. It's I want to feel like I'm wearing the right things for the right situation. And I think elite women just had more situations where they needed to be formally dressed than non-elite women did, really. And so you don't want to be wearing a garment that is sort of the like lays around the house thing. Not that that's obviously how they framed it. When you're going out and doing something formal and where you want to be well presented, you know. So I think it's kind of a push and pull of how far do we think of it as something that they couldn't do because, you know, patriarchal oppression wasn't letting them do it, and how far is it actually part of a slightly more nuanced understanding of comfort and what people would want to wear, because you don't always necessarily want to wear the thing that is super comfortable, you know. That's not necessarily going to give you the confidence that you want in a given situation. So it's kind of it's a bit complicated, but I'm sure there were women who were like, I just wish I could wear this and everyone's going to look at me weirdly if I do. So
And I think super quickly before we go on to our last question and we have to wrap things up, there's another specific question for you, Jordan, if you could answer that one quite quickly, from Natalie, who says she'd love to know how you feel your work connects maybe to ideas of the material turn or the embodied turn, as you might have seen discussed by Hilary Davidson. I don't know if there's a...
No, that absolutely does. I love, Hilary Davidson's work has been a big influence on mine and her kind of, she's written this article where she coins this term, the embodied turn, and also experimental history, which is the one I've sort of adopted. And it's very much something I've sort of fed off and want to feed back into kind of going forward with how I'm thinking about reconstruction and those kinds of methodologies, for sure.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think just for our final question, I'm sorry that there'll be a few that we haven't been able to get around to answering, but we're going to have to wrap up now. Therese asks, is it hard to implement reconstruction when working in academia or on academic texts? I don't know if we can all maybe say something about that to wrap up the session. Alyssa, would you like to start? You're nodding.
I can do that. But just like reconstruction, like recipes, not something I'm skilled at, so that would obviously be a hindrance there. But then just being able to hold porcelain and see it even with candlelight or in different settings, you're still not getting the exact same experience. And there's this kind of idea of what is genuine, what is not. And so kind of when you're working, like even if I would be taking pottery classes, I'd be working with a little bit more modern technology and those kind of things. I think they definitely help. I think it's really important. It's something I really want to do as far as like helping get that haptic knowledge, but you are kind of working in a different time period and you're having different experiences yourself. And so that is something you have to kind of separate out, which I know like Jordan, I'm sure is going to have a really good answer on this one, but it is a thing to think about. And like, I know Freya talked about the lasagna effect with country houses. I've been to a couple and you get to walk around and yeah, maybe they're the same way that they were set up and are supposed to be 18th century, but how do you put a 21st century body into an 18th century space? And so that's just something to kind of work through and keep figuring out. And over time, I think we'll be able to really to work with that.
If I might jump in quickly, I think it's a lot of that because it's like I can go and make that drink, but my life is very different. So some of the value I'm bringing to that drink will be completely different because I can get tea anytime. I can get like I can walk down streets safely. All little things that kind of feed into like you can recreate that action, but it's not just like I have recreated this and this is exactly as it would be in the 18th century. It's I am approaching this from a different mindset and being aware of your own biases within that. Like I'd mentioned with the heat, I can stand next to a heater, but will I get the same kind of experience and bring the same kind of surrounding knowledge to that as someone else who lives that experience?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, and something that can be why there has been resistance and why it hasn't been adopted more sooner. That this sort of idea of like, if we're so situated in our time period, and everyone, you know, the 18th century is so situated in its own time period, I can't replicate the 18th century. And so, well, of course you can't replicate the 18th century, that's kind of a given, but you can find ways of using reconstruction to generate knowledge that isn't available in the historical record. Yeah. And it is hard to write it up in academic text, I've been finding as I'm writing up my dissertation, because it feels really different, because you end up using I a lot more than you might normally when you're talking about findings, for example. And I think just being really upfront about what your methodology is, what the purposes of what you're doing is. So like, hasn't have to be, you know, fully historically authentic. That might not be what you're looking to do. So for example, when I was looking at kind of the fit of these garments, I didn't have to replicate the whole thing. I could just make a quick mock-up and figure out how that works. And so I'm not trying to replicate a perfect quilted waistcoat there. There's a specific thing that I'm trying to do, and it works. Whereas in other situations, you might want to replicate the whole thing for, you know, a host of different reasons. And so I think when it comes to integrating it into academia, it's just about being explicit for yourself as much as for when you come to writing about it, with what your intentions are of the project, and therefore what that means in terms of how much you have to strive for authenticity, because obviously historical accuracy is never going to be achievable because we live in the 21st century.
Well, thank you so much. Oh no, go for it, Freya. Sorry, didn't want to cut you off.
Oh no, it's that thing. It's what are you looking for? What is the thing that this serves? And it's being aware of that, and you can get so much out of it.
Absolutely. Well, that's a really fantastic place, I think, to finish. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. Jordan and Freya have to fly off because they're going to be in our next live panel discussion, which will be starting at 6:15 on public practices. And thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check out our website, which is linked in the chat, where you'll be able to find more about our research and recordings of all of the panels. Once they're all done, they'll be posted up there. Thank you so much for attending. Have a lovely evening, and maybe see some of you at the next panel discussion in 15 minutes. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.